Hello, welcome back to the weekly MEF webinar. This is your weekly spot for all things MEF. Well, where you can hear directly from the members who at the end of the day are the experts. And today is a very special webinar supported by Numeracle. So thank you very much for them for sponsoring. And I'm joined by Sarah Delphey, who's the VP of Trust Solutions at Numeracle. How are you doing, Sarah?
Doing well.
Good, perfect. And then we have Alyssia Summers, who's the Senior Manager for Messaging Traffic Assurance at Bandwidth. Are you ready to go, Alyssia?
Oh, absolutely. Hi, everyone.
Excellent. Perfect, perfect. So today what we're talking about is unifying the voice and messaging identity. I think it's fair to say that there's a fair bit of delineation when it comes to these two identities. And I think today we're going to argue that that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Today we will be focusing primarily on US voice and messaging, but we will be placing it in the context of global communication. So there's definitely things that you can learn from this, just for your own country or your own market. Sarah, why don't you set the scene for us? Well, first, tell us a little about what you do and Numerical, and then maybe you can tell us why we're having this discussion in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. So my background prior to Numerical, I've done a lot of work in messaging in the past, worked with Alyssia at Bandwidth, and now in the last year and a half or so at Numerical, I've been focusing a lot more on voice and really, it's highlighted the similarities and the overlap between some of those systems. And so I can set the stage. I think we have a lot of folks joining who have more of a messaging background and may or may not know exactly what's going on in terms of US voice registration and labeling, et cetera. So just for folks, if they don't know, so in the US within the last couple of years, the FCC has authorized terminating carriers, which for the moment is the three major mobile carriers have adopted call analytics, which means if there's a reasonable suspicion that a call might be spam, it might be fraud, those analytics engines are sitting ahead of the consumer, analyzing those calls, and then physically changing the display of that information to say spam likely, scam likely. It's different for each carrier, which can be confusing for consumers. And so, in turn, when that was rolled out, FCC mandated that a process needed to be in place for legitimate callers to be able to register their identities and also seek redress if there was an issue, if they were improperly labeled as spam. So that's what I've learned a lot about is what Numerical does is helps enterprises navigate that market. But we have a couple different systems, right? Because there's three different analytics engines, we have what's called the free caller registry, where enterprises can go register their information, and that's meant to help reduce the possibility that they might be improperly labeled by spam or a scam label, or even blocked, have their calls blocked by those carriers. And then each analytics engine separately has its own system of you can register with them separately. And then they've also added into this market branded calling solutions as well, where you can essentially not override, it's not a whitelist, but by providing that information as a paid service, then it will allow more rich display of data to the consumer. So there's a lot of innovation and discussion happening right now on rich call data and how we can validate that information and give more information to consumers. But I think a lot of people in the messaging world, if you ask them, wouldn't even necessarily know that voice registration was a thing. It is, right? We are registering and validating information for enterprises and registering it with US carriers. So if that is something that your organization is doing, if you're terminating calls to US mobile carriers, it's something that you should be paying attention to and looking into, because one of the issues today is that there's not a feedback loop for those callers to know when this has happened. No information comes back to you. There's no response code that indicates that a label has been applied to your call. There are ways of figuring that information out, and that's part of the services that Numerical provides to try and give some some, knowledge to these enterprises so that there's recourse, but it's been very confusing for a lot of callers and a lot of enterprises.
Hmm. Perfect, thank you. And Alicia, can you introduce yourself as well, and please introduce Bandwidth, and also just if you have another take on this topic, please let us know.
Of course, yeah. My name's Alyssia Summers. I am a senior manager of messaging traffic assurance at Bandwidth. I particularly work very heavily with registering, helping our customers register their messaging traffic within the industry, as well as investigating any issues downstream with like blocking, or any kind of technical issues and getting those resolved for our customers. Just to set the scene also, I'm going to talk more about the messaging space, registering messaging campaigns, which a campaign can take a lot of different verbiages, but for the sake of this conversation, it's a collection of data on what a business is going to send, essentially, in the most simplest way. And I have been in the messaging space for about 5, almost 6 years now. I'm a newbie. I have customers who have been in this space since '92. And fun fact, I was born in '92. Uh, so when I first started, you could pick up a number and literally start sending the same day with very little to no information provided to the carrier or the service provider. That a message sender can kind of help power their messages through to the handset. And in the messaging space, what we're seeing is the adoption of a more standardized process of registering campaigns across really all of the messaging channels to hold providers, I'll say hold senders, message senders, or the providers that they work with accountable for the content being sent and really confirming that that business is also legitimate. And with this shift, what a pivotal piece of the registration process is an element of human vetting. We see a lot of, I don't know if anyone has gotten those like UPS, like your UPS store pickup is delayed. Those are likely scam messages being sent out. And in order to try to prohibit those from getting to your handset, the carriers are introducing this registration process with an element on manual or human vetting. Short codes, I think, is still to date one of the most trusted channels, and the industry is taking what's working from that process, which is the manual vetting, a human eyes looking at it and scrutinizing it, and adopting it to the other messaging channels, which with 10DLC, the campaign registry, and with toll-free, with verification. And in spirit, it's a move in the right direction, but it's also brought to light operational challenges for small to medium-sized businesses to scale. Delayed onboarding has a trickle effect, which hinders the trust between a business and its customers. Trying to understand and really just detail all of these changes that are happening just proves to be difficult. And I think if you work in technology, I believe we all have this character trait that we work well under pressure and we can highly adapt to changes within the workspace. But also, I don't think that message senders really have an issue with change, but they have an issue with changes that fundamentally affect their business model with little to no warning. There are businesses that are genuinely trying to do all the right things and follow all the rules, but the continuous goal shifting or the changing of rules makes it almost impossible to create a synonymous onboarding experience.
Hmm. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. And I like that elegant definition of campaign. I'm going to use that. Perfect. Sarah, so why don't we get into it? So can you tell me about, maybe some of the misconceptions that are happening when it comes to voice versus messaging right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest misconception is that these are wildly different processes, that they have nothing to do with one another. I think people still think the voice is the Wild West and you can send whatever, you don't have to deal with any registration. Certainly, I've heard that as somebody working in messaging saying, well, we didn't have to deal with this on voice for a customer. Increasingly, you are having to deal with that on voice. And it's a challenge because we're having the same education issue with enterprises on voice and understanding that no, there's not just a guarantee that your communications are going to reach their destination. And some decisions on that may be made by companies and people you don't know who they are, you don't have any direct business relationship with them, and yet you're beholden to what they think and how they feel. And it can change a lot too. So I think that's one misconception is that things are separate and they're totally different. And two is that this is easy or that this is solvable, right? It is solvable, but it not easily, right? There's work that needs to be done in order to scale these systems, right? We're early in the journey. This is not, I think a lot of folks I've heard on different MEF events and in general have said, wow, we've got to figure out a better way to do this. And then imagine rolling back the clock 5 years. That's where we are with voice right now, is the beginnings of putting together these, better systems for categorizing and transmitting identity. And then the other piece is, it is easy to think that the folks on the other side of these decisions, the analytics engines, spam engines, whatever it is, the spam detection engines, and also the senders, I think there's a lot of misconception that there's bad faith efforts happening on either side, that the carrier that's doing the blocking or labeling is out to get you and your business, or vice versa, that you, as I think a lot of carriers I've heard speak about enterprises as though they are, operating in bad faith. They are trying to harm consumers. They're trying to get one over on each other. In my experience, 99% of the people operating in this ecosystem are not acting with malice, right? They're not acting to defraud folks. Certainly those exist and they ruin things for the rest of us. But that is the thing that I think can get in the way a lot of us making progress on this issue, is just, I can't make a system because they're just going to exploit it, right?
Yeah. And yeah, coming from the MEF side, I mean, we talk about fraud a lot. And, sometimes it might give you an impression that fraud is really, really rampant, which is not necessarily the case. It's a very, very, it's a minority of people. But, we're also good people and we try to do the right thing. So that's why we try to prevent it as much as possible. And that's why clearly, more work always needs to be done. But especially when it comes to voice, it seems like more work needs to be done. Alyssia, obviously you're more on the messaging side, but have you ever seen these sort of misconceptions? Have you come across them in your day to day?
Oh, absolutely. And to touch on what Sarah said, not being so knowledgeable on the voice side, trying to keep up with the changes on messaging keeps me busy enough. But at the end of the day, everyone is trying to protect the consumers. And the biggest misconception, I guess we could say, is, again, as Sarah mentioned, is consumers are operating in bad faith. And that's just simply not true. There are people like these senders, they just want to engage with their audience. They just want to send messages. Come get this coupon. Here's your account update, whatever the case may be. They literally just want to send these messages. But there's a huge piece that's missing, and that's just education, really, where we really need to empower or put more empowerment on those small business senders or those entrepreneurs that are just setting up a new website. And again, they just simply want to send text messages. But we can't, as an industry, assume that everyone's out to get the carriers or to scam someone. Like, now, absolutely, those people exist, bad actors. Their entire job is to learn a workaround to the system. But majority of the customers just really want to send, and we really need to start focusing on how do we make it easier for them to get into this space without having to know from 92 to current day, what are all the things that has happened and why are they happening to be in this space?
Do you come like, as on the messaging side, do you think that people miscategorize messaging as well in similar ways, or do you think it's sort of a different problem there?
Um, I think it's really the same problem, just kind of masked differently.
Yeah.
I've learned talking to Sarah so much where I think another misconception is, yeah, voice is a much more buttoned up like process over there. We need to take, I hear that a lot, we need to take what works over there and talking to Sarah, it's like, oh, wait, they're having the same issues as we are. So yeah, it's I'm really interested in just trying to figure out a way, which is why I love that we're having this conversation, is to talk about those misconceptions out loud and how they're kind of rooted in false information and like how do we start changing that narrative?
Yeah. I think there's almost sort of like people get very like they're like, oh, I'm on the messaging side or I'm on the voice side, and like that's all there is. And because they want that channel to succeed, they can't look beyond their channel and learn other lessons from other channels. When really, they're all just tools in a marketer's toolbox at the end of the day, and they have their pros and their cons, and they have a lot of shared issues. So yeah, as you say, very very well. It's great that we're all here talking about this. So Sarah, maybe we could go into some of the shared challenges. So who is validating the data when it comes to voice and messaging?
Yeah, that's been a common issue across both channels and in general. I mean, I think another thing to think about is that our problems are unique in communications. Validating customer identity and intention is a problem on every B2B platform in existence, right? Email, we've had the same issue, social media. Folks have seen Twitter and Twitter Blue and all of those things, or X, whatever it is now. These validation problems are common, and solutions, we don't have to come up with new things on our own. But that's a big piece, right? Is, I can validate my customer's information, but is anybody else going to trust me to have done so? Particularly when I have a motivation and incentive in theory, to allow this customer to get onto my platform so that they can use my services and I can do business and make money, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this element of mistrust that is so central. And, who vets the vetter, right? How do we know that when you validated this information, that it is real and that I don't just need to validate it again? And we don't trust each other. That's a very common theme across communications. We do not trust one another. And so that's led to this process of information being validated multiple times in different channels, the same information over and over again, which is very frustrating for enterprises. I mean, you think about it just in the United States, you have 3 different registrars for text messaging, whether that is short code, toll-free messaging, or 10DLC. In voice, you have 3 separate analytics engines and then powering the major mobile carriers, but then you also have consumer call analytics applications like a Numeracle or a Umail that are also making their own determinations and displays to their users. And everybody's trying to, I was having a conversation with one of those analytics engines employees yesterday for one of the major mobile carriers in the US, and confirming, we at Numeracle are validating all of this information for our customers. And most of it we don't give to the analytics engines, which is another story. They don't want or ask for it today. They don't seem to be able to process it. But what we do pass on, they're validating it again. They're not taking our word, but they're checking it. It's just a waste of time. It's not scalable. And so I think that we have to try and find the balance between the value of a human review and element, right? Which Alyssia was talking about earlier with, okay, how do we scale these systems and create transitive trust such that, you can trust that I've looked at something and I've checked these boxes and therefore you don't need to do that again. We can just keep the business rolling and keep these enterprises using these services in the way that we want them to be able to use it.
Yeah. But what do you think about sort of the issue of scaling these systems for identity? Is there a way that we can kind of do our work more effectively? You mentioned these different analytics tools, obviously. So I see you agree, but anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. There's some really exciting work that's being done right now on the voice side with regard to RCD and rich communications and being able to embed information in the call path that can be tied to more detailed and rich information about the actual entity that originated that phone call. This is something that can also be done. Obviously, there's technical issues, but the rise of RCS and messaging and rich communications is very exciting from the perspective of similar. But once you have these sort of tokenized cryptographic transmissions of these identifiers, certificates, whatever you want to call them. I call them Post-it notes that you stick on a call. I'm not an engineer. That's how I explain it to people. You stick a Post-it note on there and someone reads it at the other end. And so however you want to call it, this kind of information can also be signed to indicate, what is the information and where did it come from and who verified it. And so if we have a common set of understanding for who can sign these, what are the entities that are responsible, and who are we going to trust, then that information can be used down the line and adopted without having to re-verify it again.
And Alyssia, how do you determine the legitimacy of a brand and the specificity to the message sender?
So we have, again, like the registration processes, which as Sarah talked about, they're really different. Like I said, short codes has one, toll-free has another. I think the most troublesome one, like I call it my problem child, is 10DLC. It definitely experiences the most change that we see from carriers, and I use the term goal shifting a lot, because just when you thought you're there's another change, there's another fee, and now things are different. But I will at least say that determining the legitimacy of a brand is essentially the same, and it's captured in those campaign details. Because it's super important that a brand is really only going to be sending the content that they have registered on these, as I say, like on this paperwork. The purpose of the ecosystem is to protect consumers from those unwanted messages, but to also ensure that these senders are making it super clear to the end user who they're interacting with, because consumers do not like to get caught off guard. As I always say, we are consumers at the end of the day. I don't know anyone who has not signed up to receive text alerts from some kind. And we are more than likely to complain about a number or brand we don't recognize to our carriers, which has other implications down the line of blocking. So in making sure that, and I'll just say the legitimacy of a brand is really not, phishing is an issue, but it's not a huge error that we run into a lot. One of the biggest things is carriers have the ultimate responsibility really to protect their end subscribers. And in my opinion, I think we should definitely see them invest more in industry solutions and tools, because one of the things Sarah said, in 10DLC, what we all thought that the campaign registry was going to be, it did not. They became just kind of like a storage house for the campaign information, and they work alongside the carriers. But it's up to the campaign service providers, we call them CSPs, to vet campaigns. But a carrier can override what I think is an approvable campaign. And so if you have the ultimate authority to overrule what you said you trusted me to do this, then why aren't we seeing more of an effort or a push on their end to really invest in those tools to see it scale?
Mm. Do you think, Alyssia, that, is there any challenges with small business customers of resellers that you're seeing?
Absolutely. I touched on it earlier. It's a lack of education about the space that they're wanting to operate in. Again, they just want to send messages, but they're forced to see firsthand just how messy it all is. And it's super messy. As a business, we try to shelter our customers from that, but there is not a good call of action amongst us. If something was rejected, a minimum of 3 days for me to get an answer from anybody on it. that's not scalable. That just doesn't make a business to a consumer. Like it doesn't look good when we don't really know. We have an authority, but we don't have an authority. And at the end of the day, that small business is like, I pay you to do this thing, which is true. But it just creates a very messy process.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll
Sarah,
piggyback
oh
off
yeah,
of that if I
yeah,
can and just say that we've encountered the same problem in both voice and messaging, which is the initial focus being, and I understand why, and I participated in myself, this top-down, we start at the end with the terminating carrier of the major mobile carriers, and then we work back from there to try and get to the message sender or the caller. But the centralization and the knowledge is all over here at the end, just with a few parties that are the absolute farthest away from the actual, message sender, caller, communicating enterprise, right? And so much gets lost in translation. There might be 5, 6 different hops in the middle, and more and more gets diluted. And every single time there's one of those brand new updates that Alyssia talked about, or you need to get a question answered, getting the information from that end user all the way over and all the way back, it does not work. It does not scale. We can't keep doing it. And so that's one of the exciting things that we're looking at, and I think should also be developed in messaging is, how can we start at the beginning, right? How can we get at least a baseline set of common information that can be embedded at the front and just carried through, but come from here so that, we don't have to do this shuffling of data back and forth. It can happen in that call right there. And there can be accountability tied all the way back. Because that's the other piece is, right, when there's a problem with enforcement or there's a problem with someone, we've all seen it, right? It goes from the end for the recipient carrier who yells at their upstream, who yells at their upstream, who yells at their upstream, and it goes all the way back. And it's threats, and who knows what actually gets to the message sender, right? And by the time it gets there, there's so much frustration, there's so much momentum that a lot of times for solvable issues, we'll end up doing things like just terminating the account of that enterprise entirely rather than talking to them, because by the time we've even gotten to them, it's been a week and there's screaming happening over here, and there's no more time. We've used it up. We just need to solve the problem. So with no explanation, this enterprise is just dropped from that service because I need it to go away. I can't jeopardize my relationship anymore. And they have no idea why. And so I get why this has been created, but we're doing the same thing on all of our communications platforms. And we've got to find a better way such that, frankly, the parties that are enabling those communications can be easily identified to the recipient consumer, and we can empower those parties with knowledge to be able to determine how and when they want to communicate with each other without all of us who don't know either of these people directly trying to get in the way and interpret what each of them wants or needs, right? Which is
yeah,
what we're doing today.
exactly. Yeah. So I think that's a good transition because we've talked plenty about the challenges and the problems that we frankly both have. So maybe we can get into how do we not sort of double up on our work as you've said. So firstly, are we using the same information? Is that the same baseline basically?
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
Alyssia, I'd love to hear your take on this, but what we're looking at is, enterprise business information. We're looking at, what's your website? What's your basic details? What kinds of communications are you making? What phone numbers are you communicating with? How did you collect consent for those communications, or did you collect consent for those communications? What types of communications are you making? Are they marketing? Are they non-marketing? I mean, I think that's
That
the
sounds,
same thing, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, that sounds exactly the same that we're using over here. So like, yeah, and I keep it very simple. Simplicity is key.
Mhm.
Instead of, as we've been hinting at this entire webinar, it's instead of looking at voice and messaging as it's two distinct entities, it's how are they similar? We should start exploring those ways. Like, are we collecting the same data? Most businesses, maybe not all, most businesses would like to utilize both voice and messaging. So how do we simplify that for the average, like small business entrepreneur just wanting to start from square one who has nothing? I think it would be easier, if there was a system or something that, or a website, however we want to spin that you could register for both. It would obviously need to be researched to understand how they're both different, but then also the same, and then like what can and can't be used. But as you said, Sarah, I think, or at least on the not voice messaging side, the business legal information, like the business name, the website, that kind of stuff is usually buttoned up and it's really straightforward. But when we get into the reasons of why a business is reaching out to a consumer is where things get a little bit tricky. Because regardless of the systems or the rules, I will say, not saying everyone's a bad actor here in these use cases. I'm just going to use them as an example. Um, Debt collection and like loan marketing are what I call like high risk use cases. They are legitimate use cases, but bad actors have just abused the channels that it's just given them a bad rap. And on these campaign notices, what we'll see is instead of a customer under one of these high risk use cases saying notifications to acknowledge a consumer about outstanding debt, they'll just say, we're going to send account updates to notify them of their account standing, which sounds like it's the same, but just worded a little bit differently. Um, but those are the reasons why we're seeing the carriers try to focus on this manual vetting piece, because the devil's in the details. Like there's no amount of automation that's going to catch that this might be a third party or like debt collection or loan marketing thing. So I do think that there would just still need to be some investment done on how we make a system that could potentially combat techniques like that, but it's going to have to be a balance of automation along with human error. I mean, like human vetting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Do you think that so you're saying that sort of the human touch will always be essential, there, even in small amounts, you basically need that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's value there. And I mean, I see this all the time in vetting. Like there are the good things, the pros and cons that come with manual vetting. The bad thing, the bad that outweighs the good is when something's getting rejected that was approved before, or it was a disallowed use case that maybe somebody just didn't see like something. And like those are the things that businesses like Bandwidth can get in trouble for, because something made it through. And it's when you're solely relying on humans to do this 8 hours a day, and just so you know, don't hold me to it. I should have looked at this number before I came here, but Bandwidth can receive upwards of like 30K 10DLC campaigns a day. Imagine the staffing and the exhaustion of having to go through all of these in a day. Like human error, it's just going to happen.
It
Yeah.
is, right? And that's where I think that touches on something that I wanted to talk about, which is we are trying to treat largely everyone the same. And it's because, again, there's so much of a gap at the end for what came before that you don't know what kind of service that customer is on. You don't know what kind of limitations it does or does not have, whatever, originating service provider that they're working with for voice or messaging. And so you assume the worst for everybody. And so everybody's got to have this incredibly high level of review. But I know, Alyssia, you've seen it too. And I have some of the people who are, the most negatively impacted are the people that we've also made it hard for the best people that we all want to be on this channel to communicate, right? We've made it just as hard for them as we've made it for, sole proprietor 123 over here that, it doesn't make sense. And it's because we don't trust anything that came before. But that's where if we flip the system on its head and we thought about, okay, let's try and make this efficient and try and focus on the experience of the enterprise that's engaging into the platform and what's going to create value for them. If we start with, okay, let's validate some basic business information once and, zero in on, okay, what are the things that everybody's going to want to know? How can we knock those things out early at the front end in a way that we can all trust that that's been done? And then for whatever channel, for whatever process it is, then at the back end, all you do is just review those additional items that are specific to your channel or your carrier requirements or whatever that is. And, if people want to add, remove products, then it's just that little bit much more. And then the rest of it is already there and can be, if they have a name change, that can populate over here and be proliferated out to everyone on the back end versus every single person having to go back and update that through 4 different intermediaries. It's exhausting. And there's no reason in this day and age that we should be doing it that way. Like, let's come together as the communications industry and work with email providers, social media platforms, operating systems, Microsoft Outlook, these things that where they're already, there's business accounts that everybody has to go through 15 bajillion times. Let's come together on finding a way to make this easier, frankly, on ourselves as well as on enterprises, and save ourselves so much time and money and effort in terms of operational overhead by saying, a lot of us are worried about, well, if I don't do this, then I'm not meeting the terms of my contract with my vendor. My contract says I have to do X, Y, and Z, and I am responsible for it. So even if someone did it ahead of me, I'm going to do it. But if we could come together on saying, okay, as long as it went through these checks by these people, it's good. That's my pitch for the industry.
So
There's
this is
no
your
reason
ideal
to keep it.
scenario. If everything came crumbling down tomorrow and we had to go from scratch, that would be your perfect world?
That's my perfect world. And then the last piece of that is identity, right? In order for us to get out of the way of trying to get stuck, trying to guess at what consumers do and don't want to receive from whichever business. Part of the reason that we do that is because we haven't empowered consumers to be able to make those decisions for themselves. So we feel like we need to protect them and we need to do it for them. But if we made better systems for consumers to have more control and understanding over both who is contacting them, I'm talking, instead of a phone number, a display, a name, a checkbox, whatever it is on their phone for SMS, MMS, RCS, for them to understand who's there and voice. And then we give them the ability to control whether, their contact and their communication with that organization, then we don't need to suddenly, guess at what is and isn't wanted anymore.
Yeah. And Alyssia, just coming from the other perspective, from the messaging side, does this perfect system sound good to you, or is there anything you would add or change, or what do you think?
I really agree with everything she's saying, and just also a double pin on having a clear, authoritative entity, like a collective group, whatever the case may be, but just one set of rules to follow. I think that's what's severely missing. I always say messaging is kind of complicated. You follow so many different policies because there is not just one. There's a bandwidth policy, and if there is a service provider that is using bandwidth to power their messages, they have their own policy, which you would think is aligned, but not always aligned. You have carrier policies, and it all gets so convoluted. But at the end of the day, like, education is key. And you really just need to know the rules of the road, because when you do, you can just start building those training materials or guides, and to push for more self-service, as Sarah mentioned, on the consumer to make informed decisions and know about the industry that they are stepping into. One of the main pieces of feedback I hear in my role a lot, it's just how complicated messaging is. My customers are just willing to pay me whatever it is to just make problems go away. And I wish that I could, but
I
I
mean, they can
cannot.
only go so far, right? I mean, they
Exactly.
have to move their legs at some point. You can't do it
So
all for them. Yeah.
yeah, and I mean, and it's so difficult. And I really do understand the perspective of like, I don't really know all these things going on. I'm not going to waste my time trying to figure it out, and then it's going to change. But like, can you just do this for me? But it's because there's a lack of, like I said, information available to them. And so, in order to start pushing that self-service, we need that authoritative figure or entity to really start collecting those details, those things. So small business owners will know what they're entering, and it just shouldn't be super complicated. Like a
Mm.
lot of messaging rules aren't written, and
No.
the information's collected here, and it doesn't always get trickled back. So how can a small business really know what rules to play by if they don't know? You know, it's just unfair to your legitimate people who are really just trying to enter this space and send messages.
Mm. So you think there's some responsibility on the businesses and the consumers to educate themselves in some way? Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, okay.
And like the messaging industry doesn't make it easy. You know, I try my best, just because ever since I got into messaging, I've always had like a genuine curiosity, which has kept me, um, which has also helped excel my career as well. Like I just have a really genuine curiosity of trying to figure it out. And it's valuable information to my customers when I do this, but I am one person to 1,000 customers. So again, when we think about scale, I can't. By my fifth customer of the day, I'm a little exhausted in trying to paint the story of what's going on. So I do think that there should be more accessible information for people, even if they haven't even gotten into the industry or just thinking about it. You know, how do I vet a service provider? You know, what's the cost? You know, what are the different channels? How do I know? Where it's also not just putting everything on the businesses or the enterprise. I mean, the service providers. It's they can start doing their own shopping around over here and can kind of like get ahead in the game.
Yeah, and that's one of Meth's jobs is definitely educating the public and making it accessible to everyone. So I have to give a plug for Meth. I'm sorry. Sarah, how do we align carrier codes of conduct and terminating carrier requirements?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it. That's one of the challenges is that everyone along the way has their own, each service provider has its own set of terms and conditions, its own set of conduct. And we've tried to, how we generally have done this. I mean, yes, there's global regulations. Folks have tried to wade into this space in various jurisdictions, but even that has been inconsistent. And so, a lot, as a practical matter, generally what we do is we um, look to our vendor and or vendors, and then we try and carry forward terms from those specific vendors. And we've tried to use that to align policy across the industry more or less. But we also, most of us, some of us maybe not, but most of us live in a competitive ecosystem where consumers are using a variety of different service providers. And so those base entities have their own policies and procedures they develop separately. So at the very least, when that narrows it down, suddenly, if I'm at the front end of this, I got to worry about 12 different policies. And it creates this scenario in which there's no practical way to do it other than to take the most restrictive of those policies and make that your policy. And that doesn't make we're missing out on a lot of opportunities. And then that becomes crazy because one of these 12 terminating carriers will make one change. And then suddenly it needs to be applied to everyone everywhere. It's crazy. One person, two people, five people in a room are causing thousands of enterprises to have to go and redo all of that. I mean, the cost of that, we are just not accounting for it. And the people, those five people don't know what that cost is, and everybody else has to just deal with it. So I think if we can get aligned on that and try and come up with a set of requirements of baseline requirements that we can get folks on the network and communicating, but in a way that we feel is, potentially restricted or more safe and only allow certain additional access to folks that need it, right? Because that's the challenge we have. We have a whole variety of different kinds of businesses. We have 2-person companies and we have 10,000-person companies that we're trying to serve, and we can't treat them the same. And so for that 2-person company, is there a way that we can get them on and communicating in a way that is mutually agreed upon, that is low touch, low effort, but also low impact in terms of the risk that they can present? Now, I know that's a difficult problem to solve, but I don't feel like we've even had that conversation. And then, as folks need more, want more access, want more capability, want more volume, then we can mutually agree upon, then and only then we can go to this additional level and request those details so that the scrutiny scales with the scale of the communication and the need and the company on the other side, who's going to be most equipped to be able to answer some of those questions versus like, I've been asked, can I get an audited financial statement from every single customer that wants to make a phone call? Absolutely not. You think a small local store is going to have audited financial statements from last year they can just produce to you? It's not. It's bananas. We're living in 2 different worlds, and we gotta come together, make it easier.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the best time to worked on this was like years ago, and the second best
Sure,
time is
it's not
today,
too
right?
late.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
we can do this. So maybe it's a difficult question, but who should manage all this? Who gets to decide? Do you have any thoughts?
let's see what you
Sarah,
have.
yeah, or sorry, Alyssia, go
Oh, sorry, I just jumped in there.
ahead. No problem.
I think look, we're seeing in real time, that instead of, or at least in the messaging space, that instead of actually understanding or fixing the root issues or with tooling or improving outdated systems, we're seeing responsibilities like shift downstream, but the authority still all lies up here. And I don't particularly champion government intervention, but I think we're seeing real time. This is an Alyssia standpoint, corporate greed outweigh actual positive movement within the space. And I mean, we can take 10DLC as an example. How many times have there been like fee increases or, just these huge fines slapped down, but there is no actual movement or investment in toolings to really clear up this messaging space and get it to a good space. Um, and so I think if we continue to keep so much responsibility at the business level, I don't see us getting to a space where we're actually making it better for those small businesses that we keep discussing.
Hmm. And the same question to you, Sarah.
Yeah, I think twofold. I do think that regulation has a role to play, and that is a challenge because we have many global jurisdictions and we interoperate with one another. And so getting alignment on those is very difficult. But I have seen some interest there and some further interest in cooperation and scalability, which is great. And of course, a lot of interest in KYC in general and vetting and validation. I mean, that's grown exponentially over the last couple of years, interest in the topic, which is fantastic. But we don't have a home for us professional KYC vetting folks to talk to one another. There's offshoots of various different places where people have those kinds of conversations as maybe like one subcommittee, but there's not a home for us as a whole. So I'd love to see that. And then I think the other piece that I'd love to see is let's talk to the enterprises and the consumers. Let's get them involved. What do small businesses want? What can they do? What is going to work for them? Let's ask. And then let's talk to consumers and say, what do you want to see? How do you want to, receive information about who's calling or texting you? How do you want to interact with them? What, what do you most want to be validated? What kinds of data about that party do you want to be able to see? These are questions that, I mean, periodically folks have asked, but it's usually been in the context of specific product discovery for a private commercial enterprise of their own, and not really applicable to this particular topic as a whole. And so I think the enterprises and the consumers need to enter the discussion.
Yeah, definitely. We've been talking at a very sort of top level and a sort of broad discussion. So it'd be nice to kind of bring it down to, some use cases and get into kind of the nitty-gritty of that. How would this look for, like, let's say, like a political campaign? Do you know how would it affect that essentially? Uh,
I mean, I think,
there you go. Yeah.
sure. I mean, I can speak to it, and I'm curious in Alyssia's thoughts as well. Political campaigns are an interesting one, that I think really typify this kind of how we've gotten stuck as an industry, because they are, in many cases, legal communications. Obviously, not in all cases. We've seen the headlines, but in many cases, technically legal communications, particularly in the US. But consumers usually, often, many folks don't want to receive them. And whether or not, no matter how, easy somebody makes it to opt out of receiving further messages, which not everybody makes it so easy, still consumers that they're not, politics is polarizing. And so they're going to file complaints on this stuff, and they may not even opt out, or they opt out and they're still going to complain. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't. I don't like them either. But because of that, we've gotten stuck in trying to figure out what we should do as a communications industry and decide, are we here to apply the law? Are we here to apply consumer desires? What does that mean? Whose interpretation of that? So this is where I would love to see if we can start from the beginning and identify those political entities very clearly, and we can transmit their identities and we can display those identities to consumers if they're legitimate political entities. Frankly, none of us wants to be in the position of deciding which political organizations should and should not be allowed to communicate. I don't want that job. I don't think any of us want that job. That's not what we signed up for in the telecom space. That way lies madness. So, but if we can do that and we can make it clear, and that consumer can say either yes or no to communicating with that person and use the private legal right of action that they have in the US under the TCPA, and other rule sets, do not call, et cetera, to go after those folks if they abuse the system, that puts a lot less pressure on us to feel like we need to decide for them. Because as Alyssia knows, I mean, political communications, especially around election season in the US, which, we're getting into the thick of this year, it's really tough time to be in. No, frankly, no one likes it. No one likes it.
Yeah, and when you think about political messages, I think it simply all comes down to, like, is it wanted by the end recipient? And again, it's tricky territory, because if you read the FCC website, political messages are exempt from the do not call registry. But these senders do have to honor opt out, when it's being sent. And I haven't met a person who enjoys receiving political text messages. I mean, I get them from candidates that are on a completely different coast than me. So I'm like, how is this happening? But they are the outlier, or this use case is kind of the outlier where, again, we're seeing it's messy and no one wants to do the dirty work of trying to get it even to a better spot. You don't want to get associated with, I'm too much on this side or I'm too much on that side. So you just let it go. And you allow them to just send all these communications out to consumers, and they complain. And that's usually when they encounter the most, I'll say the most blocking or hindrance in political messages is after they've sent, and the people who have never opted into those are complaining about them to their carriers. So yeah, I think there's just a lot of work to be done on the front end of that, and pretty much looking at the legitimacy of, well, I'm not saying that they're not legitimate candidates, but really a focus on how are you getting these numbers? Are these people really opting in? And really just doing a focus on making sure that this piece is buttoned up, so we can alleviate the back end.
Yeah. Okay, I'll stop before we get too political now. But
Oh,
thank you for
yes.
Thank you.
that.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
But yeah, so when it comes to displaying data to the consumer, obviously voice has been very focused on that for a while. So how important is displaying data to you, Alyssia? What do you think about that?
Um, Sarah made a mention earlier about, I think it was scam likely or spam likely, like those types of displays that I really think would probably would go a long way in messaging, because again, as a consumer, we're all consumers at the end of the day. When I receive a message from a brand, it really doesn't matter like what the brand is. Did I opt into this? And is it a message that I want to receive? And I do. It's really helpful on my iPhone now when it's a number that I don't know and it'll say scam likely. Yeah, I'm not going to answer that because I don't know what that is. So I think that there is value in trying to implement something similar. Maybe not, it doesn't have to be the same thing. Something similar. So when consumers are receiving those UPS notifications or any kind of like phishing, there is something that's like, you might want to take a second look at this, because there are some people, like I know that I'm much more aware of messaging just because I also work in it too. And I make sure that I tell my family and my friends. But everyone's not that well versed or have someone that can teach them these things. And so those are the consumers that we really want to think about when we're trying to say, like, who are we trying to protect here? And it's
Mm,
those people that are not as educated.
yeah.
Yeah, and I'll add to
Um,
that in messaging, frankly, in text messaging in particular, and in calls as well, but it's easy. Impersonation and phishing campaigns are much easier to perform in text messaging because it is text on a page, right? When it's somebody's voice, when it's audio, you can get a sense potentially for whether this looks different than what is, is this what you expect? Is this not what you expect? Although, yes, there's very sophisticated scams out there. I don't know if anyone saw not to get back into politics, Joe Biden deep fake audio calls that came out a few weeks ago, but so yes, that's a piece as well, but especially so it has always been in messaging. It's text on a page. How do I know this is my bank or not my bank that's contacting me? And I don't memorize phone numbers. Maybe I put in a contact, but most consumers don't for that kind of thing. And so if we were able to display the actual identity of folks and guard that and have those identities be validated, it would, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it would, all we're trying to do, frankly, in fraud mitigation is make it harder and more expensive and more time consuming for fraudsters to operate. We're never going to get rid of them, but we want to give them a hard time and push them out of the market, so to speak, economically, right? That's how you hit them. And so if we make it really hard for them to display that information, and if we get consumers to expect to see that display information through, I mean, I've spent a lot of time talking to banks. They would love nothing more than to have that kind of a display come through so that it can become clear if somebody's trying to impersonate them, that it's not them, and they can have simple instruction to give to their customers on how to know when it is and isn't them texting. I mean, huge.
yeah,
They would love it.
yeah. Oh yeah. We actually got a question. Well, it's more of a statement, but before we wrap up, we have 2 minutes left. Maybe I can read that out, and we can talk about that. It's from Glenn Richards, who says, "Just an FYI, the FCC this morning released a declaratory ruling confirming that the Telephone Consumer Protection Act's restriction on the use of artificial or pre-recorded voice encompasses current AI technologies that generate human voices." You just mentioned the Joe Biden deepfake. As a result, calls that use such technologies fall under the TCPA and the Commission's implementing rules, and therefore require the prior express consent of the called party to initiate such calls absent an emergency purpose or exemption. What do you think about that, Sarah?
A real simple answer on this one. Kind of a non-event personally. Doesn't really mean too much. I think it's a no-brainer. As you just read out, the statute says artificial or pre-recorded voices, that was already the rule. And AI, that's artificial intelligence. Nobody was arguing that the voices were artificial. So I don't really think it was necessary to clarify. I think perhaps this was more to publicly appear as though they were responding to it as maybe a net new, but nothing's changed. That was already the categorization. They're just confirming artificial intelligence is in fact artificial. So
Very good. Yeah.
yeah.
We love regulation. Yeah.
Yep.
Anyway, so we're coming up to the end. So I'll give you a moment to give closing thoughts. So Alyssia, do you have any closing remarks or thoughts you want to get out there before we finish up?
Well, first, I just want to thank all of you guys. This was a very interesting, very thoughtful, insightful conversation. I am glad that we had this conversation just because I want to have more of them. I really do want to see some shifts in both industries. And now that I'm getting more knowledgeable on the voice side, I really want to talk more about ways that we can kind of combine the two and make things simpler for the average consumer. I know you talked about, Sarah, like we call them roundtable discussions. Bandwidth has roundtable discussions with some of our customers when it comes to some of these major issues in the industry. Like, what are your pain points? Like, what do you want to see? And we are engaging in those conversations with our customers in good faith to try and see what movement can we even make with our, just being a little drop in the bucket. So it's good to see that we are at least trying to begin to have those conversations. And although I know my customers can get frustrated with me at times because my hands get tied, but I genuinely do care about trying to have a shift in this to make it easier for the average consumer. But I'm excited to see what's next or what comes from this.
Definitely. And Sarah, very, very quickly, just closing remarks from yourself.
Yeah, again, thank you for hosting the conversation, and to Alyssia for agreeing to join me and share her experience. Two calls to action. One, if folks are interested in anybody who is seeing this, who is also in the KYC customer review vetting space, please reach out. I would love to work with you. And then, for anybody who has questions about blocking, labeling, registration in the voice world, reach out to me, reach out to Numeracle. We can help explain.
Thank you. Yeah. And as we said before, I think Sarah said the most important thing is to have the conversation. So we're starting it now. Hopefully we can have a follow-up discussion down the line. That would be great. Thank you to Numerical for supporting this webinar, and thank you both for being excellent speakers. Thank you guys. See you there.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.